The sky over Singapore shimmered in a hazy blue as Qantas Flight 32, an Airbus A380, rumbled down the runway at Changi Airport. The sheer mass of the aircraft, the largest passenger plane in the world, defied gravity with an almost supernatural grace. Inside, the first-class cabin was hushed in luxury. Business travelers scrolled through emails, and economy passengers settled in for the long flight to Sydney. The crew moved efficiently, securing final checks as Captain Richard de Crespigny guided the aircraft into the sky. At precisely 10:01 a.m., the aircraft lifted off, its 4 Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engines roaring with calculated fury. From the cockpit, de Crespigny glanced at his instruments, confirming a stable climb. His voice was calm over the radio, announcing their altitude increase. Everything seemed routine. And then it happened. A sharp, ear-splitting boom shattered the tranquility of flight. The aircraft lurched violently, jolting passengers in their seats. A fiery explosion erupted from the No. 2 engine on the port side, sending a plume of smoke and debris trailing behind the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, a cascade of alarms blared, and the electronic centralized aircraft monitor, ECAM, erupted in a flood of red warnings. "Engine failure," First Officer Matt Hicks shouted as the aircraft trembled beneath them. "No. 2 engine, catastrophic failure." Captain de Crespigny's hands tightened on the controls. "We need to assess damage. Matt, run the failure checklist. David, get in contact with ATC." Through the cockpit windshield, de Crespigny saw the left wing shimmering with damage, fragments of metal and engine casing embedded in its structure. But what concerned him most wasn't the fire. The fire suppression system had already kicked in. It was the silence from the No. 2 engine. The explosion had been sudden, but the aftermath was deadly quiet. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, the reaction was immediate. Gasps and shrieks rippled through the aisles as a few passengers on the left side saw the explosion firsthand. Smoke streaked past their windows. The aircraft rattled, an unnatural vibration coursing through its structure. Flight attendants moved. Swiftly, their training overtaking panic. "Everyone, remain seated, seatbelts fastened," the purser, Michael von Reth, instructed firmly over the intercom. His voice, though controlled, held an urgency that cut through the growing fear. Anxious murmurs filled the air, but there was no time for questions. The A380 was no ordinary aircraft. It was a behemoth of engineering, but even giants could fall, and at this moment it was a wounded beast limping through the sky. In the cockpit, the pilots worked through the chaos of warning lights and malfunctioning systems. The ECAM listed failures faster than they could process. Engine 2 shutdown, hydraulic leaks, fuel imbalances, electrical faults. Co-pilot Mark Johnson wiped his brow. "We've lost a significant portion of the left-wing systems. Hydraulics are compromised." De Crespigny nodded, forcing his mind to remain sharp. "We need to turn back to Singapore, contact ATC and declare an emergency. We're too damaged to continue." The radio crackled as ATC responded. "Qantas 32, confirmed. Proceed to Singapore for emergency landing. Runway clearance in progress. State ingediend. Fuel status." De Crespigny turned to his crew. "Fuel?" Hicks grimaced. "Leak in the left wing, but we still have enough for controlled descent." The captain exhaled. "All right, we take it slow. No sudden maneuvers. Everyone, eyes on instruments. This plane is coming home." The aircraft began its return to Changi, but the damage was worse than anticipated. The loss of power had disrupted multiple control surfaces. The plane was still flyable, but barely. The pilots, despite years of experience, had never encountered a failure so extreme. In the cabin, the mood was tense. Passengers clutched armrests, whispered prayers, and braced for impact. Some, still in shock, simply stared forward as if refusing to acknowledge the possibility of disaster. Flight attendants, masking their own fears, reassured passengers as best as they could, tightening seatbelts and demonstrating brace positions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Von Reth's voice returned over the intercom. "We are making an emergency. Landing back in Singapore. Please remain calm and listen to crew instructions." Through the cockpit windshield, Changi Airport loomed on the horizon. A squadron of emergency vehicles lined the runway, waiting. The pilots had only one chance to get it right. "Landing gear?" de Crespigny asked, voice firm. Johnson checked. "It's damaged, but still deploying." "Speed?" "A bit high, but within tolerance." De Crespigny nodded, steadying his hands on the controls. "We're doing this. Everyone brace for landing." The A380 descended, its massive frame shuddering as it fought against its wounds. The pilots guided it down with surgical precision, every muscle tense as they adjusted for the reduced control. The moment the wheels touched the tarmac, a deafening screech filled the air. Smoke billowed from the tires as they struggled against the weight. The plane wobbled dangerously, veering slightly left, but the pilots corrected with what little control they had left. Finally, mercifully, the aircraft came to a stop. For a moment, silence reigned. Then the cabin erupted in cheers, sobs, and prayers of relief. Passengers hugged, cried, and clung to the realization that they were alive. In the cockpit, de Crespigny exhaled heavily, his fingers aching from gripping the controls. He turned to his crew, nodding. "We did it." Fire trucks and emergency personnel swarmed the plane, assessing the damage. Outside, the full extent of the catastrophe became visible: shredded engine casing, punctured wings, and a fuselage pockmarked by debris. And yet, against all odds, Qantas 32 had survived. As passengers disembarked, shaken but safe, the crew of Qantas 32 emerged as heroes. Their skill, training, and unwavering resolve had prevented an unthinkable tragedy. And though the wreckage of the No. 2 engine still smoked in the distance, one truth remained clear. Not all disasters end in catastrophe. Sometimes they end with the triumph of human endurance. The hum of emergency vehicles filled the air as fire crews surrounded Qantas Flight 32, their high-visibility jackets flashing against the morning sun. The pilots remained in their seats. For a few moments, their adrenaline still surging as they took in the magnitude of what had just occurred. Captain Richard de Crespigny finally unclasped his harness, feeling the stiffness in his fingers from gripping the controls. He turned to his crew, his voice steady but tired. "Let's get everyone off safely." The cabin was a mixture of hushed relief and residual panic. Flight attendants worked swiftly, directing passengers towards the exits as the air bridge connected. Some passengers were too shaken to move immediately, still gripping their armrests as though expecting the plane to shudder once more. Michael von Reth, the purser, moved down the aisles, ensuring passengers exited in an orderly fashion. "You're safe now," he reassured an elderly woman clutching her husband's hand. "Just follow the crew." Outside, mechanics and engineers had already started assessing the aircraft's condition. The left wing bore the scars of catastrophe: shredded metal, punctured hydraulics, and an eerie silence where the No. 2 engine once roared. The explosion had scattered debris across the sky, some of which had landed in Indonesia. As the last of the passengers were escorted into the terminal, de Crespigny and his crew were met by Qantas officials and investigators from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, ATSB. The captain ran a hand through his hair, mentally replaying the last hour in his head. An ATSB investigator approached, extending his hand. "Captain de Crespigny, I'm Mark Lewin. We'll be conducting a full inquiry into what happened today." "Dude," Crespigny nodded. "I'll cooperate fully. We lost Engine 2 during the climb, and the ECAM was flooded with failures. It was worse than any training scenario I've encountered." Lewin glanced at his notepad. "We need the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recordings as soon as possible. This could have been catastrophic." De Crespigny exhaled. It nearly was. Nearby, passengers spoke to reporters who had already gathered outside the terminal. A businessman still clutching his briefcase recounted the explosion with wide eyes. There was this loud bang, and then the plane shuddered. I thought we were done for. Inside a secure hangar, Rolls-Royce engineers were already examining the wreckage of Engine 2. Chief Engineer Alan Mercer traced his fingers over the torn casing, his expression grim. This wasn't just an engine failure. This was uncontained. Uncontained engine failures were among the most dangerous malfunctions an aircraft could suffer. Unlike standard failures where engines are designed to contain damage, this explosion had sent debris through critical flight systems. Mercer turned to his team. We need to understand what happened before another A380 goes up. Meanwhile, Qantas executives debated their next move. Grounding the fleet was an expensive decision, but safety came first. We can't risk another incident. One executive argued, "We need to ground all A380s with these engines until we know more." Despite the financial loss, the decision was made. The public needed reassurance and pilots needed confidence in their aircraft. Later that evening, de Crespigny and his team sat in a quiet briefing room, exhausted but reflective. First Officer Matt Hicks ran a hand over his face. "I still can't believe we made it back in one piece." Co-pilot Mark Johnson exhaled. "The controls felt like they were fighting us the whole way." De Crespigny nodded. "We made the right calls, but this was bigger than anything we trained for. The A380 is built like a fortress, but today we saw its limits." Von Reth, the purser, leaned forward. "The passengers were terrified, but they listened to us. That made all the difference." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling in. They had survived the unthinkable, but there was still a long road ahead. Public and media response as news of Qantas 32 spread. Headlines flashed across screens worldwide. Qantas A380 survives devastating engine explosion. Heroic pilots. Save 469 lives. How close did Qantas 32 come to disaster? Aviation analysts debated the event, and passengers shared their accounts on social media. Videos taken from inside the cabin during the emergency circulated, showing the shaking fuselage and stunned expressions. Qantas CEO Alan Joyce addressed the media the next morning. "Our pilots and crew demonstrated extraordinary professionalism. We are working closely with Rolls-Royce and investigators to determine the cause." Passengers, though shaken, praised the crew's handling of the crisis. One woman, still clutching her boarding pass, told reporters, "I thought my life was over, but those pilots saved us." Months later, the ATSB released its final report. The cause of the explosion was traced to an oil fire inside the turbine, leading to a catastrophic failure. Microscopic cracks in the engine casing, undetected during routine maintenance, had contributed to the disaster. The report recommended enhanced inspections, stricter oversight, and modifications to prevent similar failures. Rolls-Royce undertook an extensive redesign of the Trent 900 engine, ensuring the problem would never happen again. For Captain de Crespigny and his crew, the experience left a lasting impact. They had faced the unimaginable and lived to tell the tale. Their names became synonymous with aviation excellence, their actions studied in pilot training programs worldwide. De Crespigny, reflecting on that fateful day, later wrote, "Aviation is not just about machines. It's about the people who make the impossible possible." And so, Qantas Flight 32 became more than just a flight. It became a testament to human resilience, a story of skill, teamwork, and the unbreakable will to survive.